Tonight, we are talking about the Harlem Renaissance, not as a simple artistic movement, but as a cultural uprising, a coded rebellion, and a battleground for the soul of Black America. This isn't just jazz, poetry, and pretty paintings. This is power, protest, and pride, dressed in tuxedos, draped in silk, and delivered through verses that demanded to be heard. Before you go to sleep, drop down in the comments and let us know where you are listening from. And of course, make sure you subscribe to get more soothing Black history. If you have any topics you'd like me to explore, let me know in the comments as well. All right. This era, roughly from the 1910s through the 1930s, saw Black America do something that the rest of the country had spent centuries trying to suppress: speak for itself. Loudly, creatively, unapologetically. At a time when Jim Crow laws reigned in the South and racial violence stalked every Black family from Georgia to Chicago, Harlem became a pressure valve, and then a powder keg of culture. We're going to peel back the layers of this movement. Not just the poetry, the jazz, and the glamorous nights at the Cotton Club, but the radical ideas, the clashing visions, the hidden romances, and the fights that shaped a revolution disguised as a renaissance. Because the Harlem Renaissance wasn't polite. It wasn't tidy. It was messy, it was fierce, and it was Black brilliance unleashed on a country that didn't know what to do with it. Let's get into it. Harlem wasn't supposed to be black. When developers first envisioned the neighborhood in the late 1800s, they imagined a wealthy white enclave, filled with elegant brownstones, tree-lined streets, and upper-class families sipping tea behind lace curtains. But overdevelopment collided with recession, and dreams of white affluence quickly gave way to empty buildings and panic-selling landlords. The neighborhood that was supposed to be an elite white sanctuary became an economic ghost town. That's when opportunity cracked open. In the early 1900s, a few Black middle-class families moved into Harlem, many of them coming from another neighborhood known as Black Bohemia. They were teachers, postal workers, musicians, people with just enough income and education to secure a foothold. They were followed by more, and more, and more, until white residents began to panic. Real estate values dropped. Racial tension rose. And when white residents couldn't keep Black families out, they left instead. By the 1910s, Harlem was shifting fast. But it wasn't just local migration that changed the game. What followed was one of the greatest demographic shifts in American history, the Great Migration. The Great Migration wasn't just a movement of people. It was a flood of stories, skills, trauma, and ambition. From Mississippi to North Carolina, from Alabama to Louisiana, entire families packed what little they had and moved north by train, wagon, and foot. Between 1910 and 1940, nearly 2 million Black Americans left the South in search of something that had been denied to them since slavery: possibility. And the North wasn't some utopia. Yes, it had jobs, mostly factory work, and marginally less segregation. But it also had redlining, racial quotas, and deeply embedded discrimination. Still, for many Black migrants, the North represented a place where you could breathe. Where you might not get lynched for looking someone in the eye. Where you could start over. By 1920, over 300,000 black Southerners had made the journey. Harlem became the crown jewel of this exodus. What was once a failed real estate project became a cultural epicenter, a tightly packed fusion of Southern blues, Caribbean beats, church rhythms, and city hustle. Harlem didn't just house black people, it held their histories, their hopes, their contradictions. Barbershops became debate clubs. Churches doubled as concert halls. Street corners transformed into poetry slams. You could hear Marcus Garvey preaching black nationalism on one block and catch a jazz solo echoing off the fire escapes on the next. At its peak, Harlem was the blackest place on earth, both in numbers and in energy. It was a living organism, pulsing with possibility. These were people who had lived under the weight of cotton quotas, lynching threats, and second-class citizenship their entire lives, and now, they were packed into a few square miles, with nothing left to lose and everything to express. Harlem was no longer a neighborhood. It was a canvas. And soon, it would become a movement. But movements need voices, and Harlem had plenty. This was the era when black writers, poets, thinkers, and rebels picked up their pens and decided they didn't need permission to be brilliant. At the center of this wave was a quiet visionary named Alain Locke. In 1925, he released The New Negro, an anthology that didn't just introduce new black voices, it demanded the world listen. Locke wasn't just showcasing art. He was building a philosophy that black Americans were not problems to be solved, they were creators, philosophers, and intellectuals capable of shaping the American soul. Langston Hughes was one of the loudest and most lyrical of those voices. Born in Missouri, raised across the Midwest, Hughes arrived in Harlem with a typewriter and a mission to capture black life in all its raw, complex, everyday beauty. His poems weren't just sonnets or stanzas, they were jazz on paper. With lines that dripped rhythm and resistance, Hughes became the unofficial poet laureate of Harlem. His work didn't ask for sympathy. It asked for recognition. Then there was Zora Neale Hurston, anthropologist, folklorist, and pure literary fire. Where Hughes chronicled Harlem's heartbeat, Hurston dug into its roots. She traveled the South, collecting black stories, idioms, songs, and spirituals. Her work was rooted in the voices of black women, black workers, and black families whose lives weren't often seen as literature. Her language wasn't polished, it was real, messy, and alive. And that's what made it revolutionary. Jesse Redmond Fawcett, meanwhile, was the gatekeeper. As the literary editor of The Crisis, the NAACP's flagship magazine, Fawcett had the power to make or break a writer's career. She introduced the world to many of the Harlem Renaissance's most essential voices. But she didn't just publish others. She wrote her own novels, exploring themes of passing, identity, and what it meant to be black and ambitious in a country built to hold you back. Claude McKay brought the heat, both literary and political. A Jamaican-born writer with a revolutionary soul, McKay's poems didn't just entertain, they confronted. In his poem If We Must Die, written during a wave of race riots in 1919, McKay called on black Americans to resist, not with fear, but with dignity and defiance. His words were so powerful, Winston Churchill later quoted them during World War II. Let that sink in. These writers were doing more than telling stories. They were shaping identity. They were drawing lines in the sand and saying, "This is who we are. This is what we sound like. And we're not going anywhere." And the world started to listen. Magazines like Opportunity and The Crisis began showcasing black voices with boldness. For the first time, white publishing houses were forced to reckon with the reality that Black America wasn't just a consumer of culture, it was a creator of it. The work was gritty, intellectual, sexy, humorous, tragic, and above all, real. These were not sanitized versions of black life written for white approval. They were declarations of autonomy. Sociologist Charles S. Johnson, editor of Opportunity, took a more strategic approach. He knew that white publishers had money and access, and he played the game masterfully. Johnson's literary contests and awards provided cash, exposure, and networking to Harlem's writers. His role in shaping careers was massive, quiet, but powerful. Where Du Bois might have demanded dignity, Johnson helped writers find the platform to define it themselves. Even as Harlem's artists were making noise on the page, there were battles behind the scenes. Some writers, like Du Bois, believed art should uplift and dignify black people, reflecting only the best aspects of their character. Others, like Hurston and Hughes, pushed back. They believed real art had to reflect the full spectrum of black life, the beautiful and the broken, the holy and the hood. There were fierce arguments in editorials and salons over what black art should be. Should it challenge stereotypes or ignore them entirely? Should it imitate white literary traditions or reinvent them? And who got to decide? Then came Fire, a literary journal that burned hot and fast. Created in 1926 by Langston Hughes, Zora Neale Hurston, Richard Bruce Nugent, and others, it was a direct challenge to the older generation. It showcased queer stories, dialect-heavy writing, and taboo themes like colorism, sex work, and mental health. It was scandalous. It was brilliant. It was ahead of its time. And it only lasted one issue before going bankrupt. But in that single issue, it lit a fuse that would continue to smolder for decades. Richard Bruce Nugent, one of the few openly gay Harlem Renaissance figures, published Smoke, Lilies, and Jade, a dreamlike, erotically charged short story that broke every rule of respectable writing. It was unapologetic, deeply personal, and completely radical. In a world where queerness was criminalized, Nugent's art was an act of rebellion. And that was the soul of the Harlem Renaissance, an ecosystem where rebellion bred innovation. Harlem wasn't just producing writers. It was producing new ways to write, to think, to live. The art exploded out of poetry slams, out of rent parties, out of passing glances on crowded sidewalks. Creativity became contagious. Literary salons and writers' circles sprang up in apartments lit by flickering gas lamps. Intellectuals debated race theory over bootleg liquor. Poets found inspiration in street preachers. Philosophers sharpened their ideas in the back of cabarets. Harlem was academia and alleyways, jazz riffs and journal entries, dissertations and dirty jokes, all at once. And while the writers told stories, the stories told the world, we are here. We have something to say. And whether you print it or not, we're going to write it. So Harlem kept writing. Loudly. Boldly. And with every poem, every short story, every smuggled zine and magazine, it chipped away at the silence that had tried to swallow black voices whole. To understand just how powerful the Harlem sound was, you have to step inside one of those legendary speakeasies, the Lafayette, Small's Paradise, or Connie's Inn. These weren't just clubs. They were sanctuaries, laboratories, runways, and boxing rings all at once. Jazz musicians didn't just rehearse, they battled. Every night was a contest, a show of musical dominance, a flex of innovation and stamina. If you couldn't hold your own, you didn't play. This pressure cooker environment bred legends. Musicians took risks. They played off script. They invented notes. They rewrote the rules of Western music theory without even trying. Improvisation wasn't just style, it was survival. Harlem jazz was born in uncertainty and thrived in chaos. And women weren't just singing pretty backup vocals. They were headlining. Bessie Smith commanded rooms with her unfiltered presence. Ethel Waters transitioned from blues to Broadway, breaking barriers on the stage. Alberta Hunter's voice told stories no newspaper dared print. These women had lived hard lives, abuse, poverty, racism, and they sang through it with grit, grace, and fury. They weren't just artists. They were historians with microphones. Harlem music also became political, even when it wasn't overt. Songs like Black and Blue by Fats Waller disguised sorrow inside melody. Lyrics carried double meanings. Rhythms were layered with coded messages. Musicians spoke truth in a language only the oppressed could fluently understand. Then there was jazz's cultural cousin, the rent party. When Harlem tenants couldn't afford the month's rent, they didn't beg. They threw a party. A real one. They cleared out furniture, set up a bar, and passed the hat. For the price of a few nickels, you could get a drink, a dance, and a night you'd never forget. These rent parties were economic lifelines, but they were also communal, creative incubators. Langston Hughes himself wrote about them. They were loud, sweaty, poetic, and essential. They paid the bills and fed the culture. And while Harlem's elite dined at Sardi's and wore tailored suits, the real movement thumped through wood floors at midnight. The Renaissance had a bass line, and if you listened close, you could hear a generation reinventing itself in real time. Even the instruments were revolutionary. The piano, long seen as a symbol of white gentility, got rebranded. Harlem pianists turned it into a weapon. James P. the Johnson stride style made ivory sound like thunder. Willie the Lion Smith was a showman and a technician. Art Tatum's fingers were so fast and precise, people swore he had extra hands. These men didn't play the piano. they made it confess that music had always been a survival tool for Black America. In Harlem, it became a sword, and no one escaped its swing. It was a machine, and at its core were the writers who turned pain into poetry, struggle into sentences, and survival into something sublime. If music was Harlem's pulse, then theater was its face, and what a face it was. The Harlem Renaissance shattered every rule about who got to stand in the spotlight and what stories could be told on stage. Before this era, black actors were often relegated to minstrel shows, caricatures, and stereotypes so grotesque they made a mockery of black existence. But Harlem lit the fuse on a theatrical revolution. And Paul Robeson was holding the match. A lawyer, football star, actor, singer, and political lightning rod, Robeson didn't just break molds, he shattered them. His deep, commanding voice and towering presence redefined the expectations of a black man on stage. When he performed Othello, audiences saw something new, a black man not as comic relief, but as tragedy, intellect, power. His portrayal was so iconic, the role became inseparable from his name. Robeson believed in more than performance. He believed art was a weapon. That every show, every song, every stage appearance could dismantle centuries of racist propaganda. And so he used it. But the cost was high. As his politics became bolder, he was targeted by the government, blacklisted during the McCarthy era, and surveilled by the FBI. Yet even in exile, his legacy roared. He wasn't alone. Harlem's theater scene exploded with complexity. Willis Richardson, one of the first black playwrights to gain national attention, turned away from stereotypes and instead crafted human stories, nuanced, layered, and grounded in real black life. His plays rejected buffoonery in favor of dignity, struggle, and resilience. The Krigwa Players, founded by W.E.B. Du Bois, provided a home for black dramatic writing. They staged one-act plays, often written by Harlem authors, that explored themes of migration, colorism, family, and survival. They performed in libraries, community centers, and makeshift stages anywhere they could gather an audience. Because to them, the message mattered more than the marquee. Harlem also nurtured black women playwrights and actresses who refused to be silent. Anita Scott Coleman, Eulalie Spence, and Marita Borner used the stage to confront issues often ignored: black womanhood, interracial relationships, and generational trauma. They weren't just writing plays. They were opening wounds. Meanwhile, vaudeville and musical theater were being reshaped from the ground up. Shuffle Along, the 1921 Broadway hit by Noble Sissle and Eubie Blake, shattered expectations. It was the first major musical written, produced, and performed by black artists. It made stars out of Josephine Baker and Paul Robeson and proved black talent could sell out shows and steal the spotlight. Shuffle Along wasn't just popular, it was revolutionary. It brought syncopated rhythms, tap dancing, and unfiltered black joy to Broadway. And it opened the door for black narratives to be seen on their own terms, not as curiosities, but as centerpieces. Black dancers, too, were rewriting the language of movement. Bill Bojangles Robinson took tap dancing off the vaudeville circuit and onto the world stage. He danced with precision and power, trading soft shoe for swagger. He paired with Shirley Temple in a groundbreaking interracial performance, yet faced criticism for softening his politics. His life, and his dance, was full of contradictions, like much of Harlem itself. But not all of Harlem's stage brilliance made it to the mainstream. Many performances lived and died in local halls, never recorded, never reviewed, never remembered outside of those rooms. Yet their impact was real. These shows were more than entertainment, they were community rituals, healing ceremonies, and acts of protest in spotlight form. And all of this unfolded under the sharp gaze of white critics, patrons, and audiences who often tried to claim black brilliance without accepting black humanity. Harlem performers were applauded on stage and ignored in lobbies. They could command an audience, but not a seat in the front row. Still, they performed. They wrote. They choreographed. They built theaters from the ground up. They told stories no one else dared to tell. Because for Harlem, theater wasn't a diversion, it was a declaration. While Harlem's writers filled pages and its musicians filled clubs, another group of artists began filling canvases, and they weren't asking for permission. Visual artists of the Harlem Renaissance were up against a brutal truth: the American art world didn't just ignore black creators, it actively excluded them. Galleries refused their work. Museums denied them entry. Art schools often barred their enrollment. And still, they painted. They sculpted. They photographed. Because erasure was not an option. Aaron Douglas, often called the father of Black American art, became the Renaissance's visual vanguard. His work wasn't just beautiful, it was political architecture. Douglas blended African aesthetics, Egyptian motifs, Cubist geometry, and American modernism to create something entirely new. His silhouettes, layered, angular, and luminous, told stories of heritage, struggle, and rising black consciousness. His murals graced libraries, schools, and institutions, whispering rebellion in every brushstroke. Douglas's art was a call to arms and a history lesson wrapped into one. His illustrations for books, magazines, and the new Negro anthology brought his distinct vision to the masses. His figures were always in motion, never still, never passive. They marched, reached, sang, fought. Douglas gave Black America a visual identity that was dignified, defiant, and dynamic. But he wasn't alone. Augusta Savage was sculpting a revolution of her own. Born in Florida, the daughter of a Methodist minister who believed sculpture was sinful, she carved clay in secret as a child. Harlem gave her the space to be seen. Her bust of W.E.B. Du Bois gained critical acclaim, but when she applied to a French art school, she was rejected, not for her talent, but for her race. She didn't stop. She kept sculpting, kept teaching. Savage eventually opened her own studio and mentored the next generation of black artists. She created the harp, a towering piece inspired by black spirituals, for the 1939 World's Fair. But in a gutting twist of fate, the sculpture was destroyed after the fair ended. No casting. No preservation. Just demolition. It was a brutal metaphor for how America consumed black creativity but refused to archive it. Then there was Meta Warwick Fuller, one of the few artists to gain recognition before the Renaissance fully bloomed. A protégé of Rodin, she used sculpture to explore African heritage and the trauma of slavery. Her works, raw, emotive, sometimes terrifying, were often too honest for white audiences. That didn't stop her either. Photographer James Van der Zee told Harlem's story through the lens. His studio portraits captured the glamour and grit of black life in the 1920s and 30s. Newlyweds, children, pastors, gangsters, jazz musicians, he photographed them all with elegance and dignity. In a world flooded with degrading images of blackness, Van der Zee's work was radical in its celebration. He didn't just snap photos. He staged them. He edited them with care. He added backdrops, props, and painted in details. His goal was to elevate his subjects, to show the world the version of black life that deserved to be seen. When you look at his photos, you don't see stereotypes, you see legacy. Meanwhile, murals and paintings began transforming Harlem's public spaces. Stairwells, storefronts, community halls, they became galleries. Art moved from the museum to the street, democratized and electrified. This was creativity by the people, for the people. It wasn't always polished. It wasn't always permanent. But it was always powerful. And then there were the self-taught artists, the rebels with no formal training but deep, intuitive genius. They used whatever materials they could find, wood scraps, house paint, broken glass. Their work didn't always hang in galleries, but it hung in hearts. It told the stories that textbooks wouldn't touch. Black visual art during the Harlem Renaissance wasn't just representational, it was a time for reclamation. It seized back the right to be seen, to be beautiful, to be complicated, to be human. These artists were carving out space in a world that told them they had none. Every portrait, every sculpture, every frame was a confrontation. Look at us. Not as criminals, not as caricatures, but as creators. And as the paint dried and the flash bulbs popped, Harlem's visual artists built a museum without walls, one that continues to influence and inspire, even now. The Harlem Renaissance wasn't just a cultural boom, it was also a feeding frenzy. As Harlem's streets pulsed with brilliance, not everyone who showed up came with good intentions. For every sincere supporter, there was a voyeur. For every ally, an opportunist. And at the heart of it all was one complicated truth: Harlem was profitable. Enter Carl van Vechten, a white writer, photographer, and self-proclaimed champion of the Harlem scene. On paper, he was an ally. He published black writers, promoted their work to white publishers, and used his influence to put Harlem artists in rooms they might have never entered. But in 1926, he wrote a novel titled Nigger Heaven, a story set in Harlem, dripping with slang, sex, and what he saw as the real Harlem experience. The title alone sparked outrage. W.E.B. Du Bois was livid. He called it an affront. But others, like Langston Hughes and Zora Neale Hurston, had more complicated takes. They appreciated Van Vechten's influence and didn't dismiss the doors he'd helped open. But the tension remained: was he honoring Harlem or exploiting it? Was he helping the movement or just profiting from its mystique? Van Vechten wasn't the only one. White journalists flocked to Harlem clubs to write breathless columns about the Negro nightlife, while ignoring the actual lives of the people performing for them. Rich patrons funneled money into Harlem art not because they believed in it, but because it made them feel edgy, progressive, fashionable. It was art tourism at its finest. And Harlem's artists had to walk a tightrope between exposure and exploitation. Rent parties were another case in point. What started as community solutions to economic hardship quickly became scenes of fascination for uptown slummers, white New Yorkers who ventured into Harlem for booze, music, and a taste of the exotic. They brought money, yes, but also mockery. They loved the art, but flinched at the politics. They danced to black music, but voted for the same systems that kept black families in poverty. Even publishing was a battlefield. White editors pushed for safe content, stories that didn't challenge white sensibilities, didn't dig too deep, didn't sound too angry. Writers who wanted to make rent often had to choose: tell the story they needed to tell, or tell the story they knew would sell. Some found a way to do both. Others were forced to compromise. The Harlem Renaissance, for all its brilliance, existed within a racist economy. One where success often came with strings attached. Where even the most lauded black creators had to fight to control their own narratives. White patrons funded their art but tried to dictate its message. White-owned media spread their names but filtered their meaning. And yet, even in the midst of this exploitation, the Harlem artists resisted. They wrote around the censors. They layered meaning into metaphors. They turned satire into sabotage. Their work became Trojan horses, delivering truth inside beauty. There were real allies, too. Charlotte Mason, the wealthy white patron who funded Zora Neale Hurston's folklore expeditions, genuinely supported black art, but insisted on being called godmother, a term that underscored the power imbalance. Her money came with expectations, her praise with paternalism. Hurston, brilliant and fiercely independent, eventually broke from Mason. But not before collecting the folk stories, songs, and spirituals that would become the backbone of her work. And the cultural record of Black America. This was the trap many black artists faced. To gain visibility, they had to partner with those who didn't always see them as equals. And when they tried to assert control, they risked losing everything: funding, access, platform. It was a cultural dance with predators and patrons alike. The Harlem Renaissance made it clear: appreciation without equity is exploitation. Admiration without respect is theft. And that tension never really left. Today, you'll find museums full of Harlem's art, but few Harlem artists in the boardrooms. You'll hear jazz riffs in commercials and see vintage Harlem prints sold online, but who profits? Back then, as now, black brilliance drew a crowd. But too often, the artist was left unpaid, uncredited, unprotected. Still, the Renaissance didn't stop. It couldn't be bought off. It couldn't be boxed in. It kept creating. Because Harlem's artists weren't just trying to get rich. They were trying to get free. Every movement, no matter how electric, eventually hits a wall. For the Harlem Renaissance, that wall came crashing down in the form of two national disasters, the stock market crash of 1929 and the Great Depression that followed. In a matter of months, patronage dried up. Book advances stopped. Club gigs vanished. Magazines folded. Art couldn't pay the bills anymore because the bills had tripled and the rent was still due. White patrons, the ones who had once filled Harlem's clubs and galleries, suddenly had their own problems. They stopped coming. Stopped paying. Stopped pretending to care. The rich retreated to their mansions, and Harlem's artists were left to fend for themselves. And then came 1935. On March 19th, a false rumor spread that a young black boy had been beaten to death by store employees in Harlem. The outrage was instant. Crowds formed. Tension soared. And then Harlem exploded. The Harlem riot of 1935 left 3 people dead, hundreds injured, and millions in damages. It wasn't just about one boy. It was about years of broken promises, rising poverty, and a sense that the dream had rotted beneath the surface. The riot marked the symbolic end of the Harlem Renaissance. The lights didn't go out all at once, but they dimmed. One by one, artists moved away or went underground. Some turned to political activism. Others faded into obscurity. A few, like Langston Hughes and Zora Neale Hurston, kept creating, though the nation's attention had moved on. But here's the truth, the Harlem Renaissance didn't really end. It just changed clothes. Its spirit shapeshifted into the civil rights movement. Into Motown. Into hip-hop. Into protest art and Black Twitter and poetry slams and Black Panther films. The DNA of the Harlem Renaissance is everywhere, woven into every beat, every bar, every brushstroke that defies erasure. Its writers taught us to name ourselves. Its painters showed us how to see ourselves. Its musicians taught us to move through pain. And its actors taught us how to perform not just survival, but joy. It birthed a generation that refused to be quiet, refused to be polite, and refused to be forgotten. And it left behind more than legacy. It left behind a challenge. To create boldly. To tell the truth, even when it costs you. To uplift your people while the world tries to push them down. To see beauty in your own reflection when everything around you tells you not to. The Harlem Renaissance wasn't perfect. It was messy. It was complex. It was full of contradictions. But it was ours. Unmistakably, unapologetically ours. And while the world moved on, Harlem never forgot. The fire didn't die. It just spread.